Warning. The following podcast features views and opinions that are likely to trigger the extreme fanboys and fangirls who disagree with them. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to another episode of Hot Takes with Billy Biz. Today's episode is brought to you by Reboot It. Season 2 is now available exclusively on YouTube because you have to see it to believe it. But today on Hot Takes with Billy Biz, we're talking 2010's Tron Legacy. And joining me, one of the most requested guests every time, back for season 3, Mr. Victor Dandridge.
Why, hello. Am I really one of the most requested guests? Seriously?
You are. Both of your episodes from the last season were some of the highest downloaded episodes. So you know how to pick the movies, or people just like you, man.
I mean, either way, I'm good. I'm loving y'all back. Yeah.
Well, today we're talking Tron Legacy, and this is an interesting one because when you think of Tron, I put this in the category of one of those movies that I'm kind of shocked is not more of a franchise than it ended up being. I put this in like the Zorro bucket, where you're like, really? There's only 2 of them? I would have thought that would have been a bigger thing.
That's a fair statement, though. What's interesting to me, though, is that I think Zorro came in at a certain time, and it explains why there's only 2. It wasn't really at a time period where there were a lot of multi-franchise installments of things. You had like Star Wars, Superman, and Batman. Maybe
right.
Aliens at the time. That was about as far as it went, as more than 2. So, that's kind of a rare bird. I don't even think we had a third not Transformers, but Terminator at that time.
We didn't get a third Terminator until like 10 years, actually like 12 years after Terminator 2.
Right.
I didn't know until I was an adult that all those different like Clear and Present Danger, all those Jack Ryan movies were the same dude.
I mean, yeah, see, exactly. Like they are supposed to be, but that doesn't count either. Like that's
So the interesting thing about Tron is let's go back a little bit to the first Tron movie.
Okay.
The first Tron movie was really, for its time, incredibly visually groundbreaking.
Absolutely.
This was something where, you talk about, look, I watched Tron. By the way, Tron, the first one came out in 1982.
Right.
So this was kind of hot off the heels of, Star Wars and Empire, and, Star Trek was, I think they must have just come out with Wrath of Khan. So sci-fi was kind of, it was finding its footing in this new kind of special effects. They weren't looking as dinky as maybe they did, in the early 70s, late 60s.
Right.
But Tron was really, I watched this first Tron movie probably a year before Legacy came out because I'd never seen it, and I knew that Tron Legacy was going to be something big, something special, and I wanted to watch Tron. Oh boy, you talk about, for me at least, style over substance. Tron 1 is a slog for me.
I mean, okay, to be fair, it was by design more of a visually graphic movie more so than story. That is 100% true. Like, you can tell that by the way that, okay, this movie is called Tron, and Tron is not the quote-unquote main character.
Tron is like the third most important character in
right.
Tron. Tron arguably is not even really in Tron Legacy.
Right? Like, and that's the thing that already sets the tone for how offbeat this whole franchise is gonna be.
But I definitely think, even though up to that point I hadn't seen Tron, I understood that Tron was something kind of special. It was something kind of unique. Even now, like going back, I've watched Tron again since then, I think once. But even going back and just checking out clips before recording this episode, like even though it was of its time and it looks like kind of 80s graphics, it still also kind of looks unique unto itself, which, it's like the 80s graphics plus kind of the rotoscoping that they did on them.
Right.
Like it has its own visual style that kind of, at least in my mind, surpasses the technology of that time.
I can wholeheartedly agree. And it's also fresh because no one parodied it either. Like the whole thing with bullet time in the Matrix is really cool, and then everyone started parodying it, and so it became less cool. It became less interesting and less of a true signifier of what important technological advances that movie made. But Tron, no one's ever really teased Tron.
Yeah, no one ever really quite did it like they did it. And you're right. It was like, I remember too, it was kind of like, I remember when Sin City came out in 2005, and that just was such a bold, unique take on comic book movies and using CGI. And then they turned around and they did it like with The Spirit, which is one of the weirdest, craziest, worst movies I've ever seen. But the turnaround was like, you know, within 5 years, they had another one of quote unquote those. I never saw another one quite like Tron. So that kind of, you know, I think when you think of Tron, I don't think of Tron as a good movie, but I think of it as kind of like a benchmark, you know, kind of how Lucas seems to feel about Star Wars movies, where it's like plot is secondary to technical achievements. Like, what did you learn from this special effects wise?
Right. Well, see, I don't know if I would compare it to Star Wars.
I'm not comparing it to Star Wars in the sense of what it is. I'm comparing, you know, how Lucas felt about, you know, one of his biggest criticisms of the sequel trilogy that just came out was it didn't push the envelope in terms of
what could be done.
Of new visual effects, new ways to do things. And so I think Tron at the time came up with its own visual style, definitely pushed the limits of what they could do with computer graphics, but it didn't, you know, I'm not, trust me, the hot take is not that Tron is anywhere near the lore of Star Wars. I'm not like clinically
Well, no.
insane.
What I meant was like the thing that I compare it to is the original Clash of the Titans, where it is one of those movies that as time and technology progressed, I would have loved to have seen a remake of that movie, not because the story was at all in question. It was what we could do visually is so much more that's the grounds to see it. Now, obviously, with Clash of the Titans, we got a remake, and with Tron, instead, we got a sequel, which I think is the thing that sets them apart. But that's the thing that I would have compared it to of those movies that could have seen a technological jump in the graphics. Also see RoboCop, that could change how we feel about what we saw. Whether or not it changed the story is irrelevant.
You're 100% on the money. And I think maybe that's why a sequel to Tron kind of lingered unmade for quite a while. I think the first Tron was a moderate success at best. A lot of people criticize the storyline for being pretty incoherent, which it definitely is. But again, you know, we're talking 82, groundbreaking visuals, and the acting for what it was pretty good. But there was no sequel for a long time. Then around the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a video game that came out, and people were kind of starting to be like, are we going to get a new Tron? You know, there were rumblings, and then finally it started to kind of coalesce. Now, what's interesting to me is that they gave this big tentpole movie, Tron Legacy, to a first-time director, Joseph Kosinski, who would later go on to do Oblivion with Tom Cruise, and he's now doing Top Gun Maverick, which is kind of crazy. But he also is not a traditional director. He started as an architect. So he really brought like the design aspect to Tron Legacy, and I kind of feel like it definitely shows.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the best parts of it, is to just look at the graphics and go, how did they come up with that? Like, not even just, you know, how did they make it? Who originated that concept as to what, you know, anything within the grid looks like, how it functions? That stuff is pure beauty.
Yeah, it's hard to describe especially if you haven't seen the first Tron, but if you have, or even if you've kind of seen clips, it feels like the first Tron movie, everything in the grid is very 2D.
Right.
Whereas this is very 3D, it's very dimensional, it's very geometric, it's very clean. It's a different grid than the first movie, but I feel like it definitely sets it apart almost as a soft reboot, I feel like.
Well done. Yeah, I like that.
The other thing that's interesting that I want to go back and look at for a minute is this came out in 2010, and I feel like 2010 was right in the middle of a huge shift in not only blockbusters, but just kind of like movies and audience expectations in general. We had just come off of 2 years prior, The Dark Knight. And the other side of that coin in the same summer was Iron Man. So I feel like this, 2008 is really where I trace like the golden or silver age of comic book movies that we're still currently in. But it also changed. I kind of feel like Dark Knight especially changed movies going forward in terms of there was now this push to take your property and can you make it a little more serious? Can you make it literally a little darker?
Right.
And I have nothing to really base this on other than what I see. But when I look at Tron Legacy, especially having watched all the Dark Knight trilogy last week for another episode I'm doing, there's definitely to me influences from Christopher Nolan and Wally Pfister's Dark Knight in the look of this whole movie.
Absolutely. I think the tonal shift of it, in terms of making it serious, all adds to the majesty of what the graphics are, because there's a certain camp that the original Tron inherently had because of how fluorescent and crazy and over the top it was, but there's a grounding of the visuals, even though it's as far as advanced and futuristic as it is, because of how serious the tone is. I mean, you're talking, genocides and abandonment. Like that's a lot of heavy stuff for a Disney flick.
Yeah, there's also just like I'm not gonna say they lifted it, but there's a lot of like similarities. You have a kid who has inherited his quote unquote dad's company,
right?
And he's kind of going afoul or going against the law, even though he's a good guy. I mean, still, the Bruce Sam parallels are still there.
Right.
And then, even so much as like I get, from Alan, I kind of get like a Lucius Fox kind of vibe from him.
I'm 100% with you on this one. Like you a genius, sir. I like this. Keep going.
Even like the really odd Cillian Murphy uncredited appearance was like, that's we're not going to play that up. That is what it is. All right. Interesting. You know
what? I do think that was something that was going to be played out more if the movie was more successful and there was a sequel.
I mean, that's the crazy because he plays the son of the bad guy Dillinger from the original Tron. So they like kind of, they go out of their way to make sure that you know who he is.
Right.
For a payoff that is never going to come. Never ever. But again, just still, it was like, I'm getting some serious Dark Knight vibes while watching this. But I do think that just speaks to the bigger, like, again, in 2010, a lot of look at the summer lineup for 2010 and minus Inception and Toy Story 3, which are kind of doing their own thing.
Right.
Everything else had not yet caught up to the quote unquote Dark Knight way of doing things. Like you look at things that should have been like home runs for these studios, like the A-Team, and it was still kind of this like 90s, early 2000s way of making movies. But by the time Tron Legacy came out, it kind of felt like this is where the shift was, where it was like, we are in a post Dark Knight world now, and taking your maybe quote unquote silly IP and putting a very grounded but very serious, almost gritty approach to it is now kind of baseline.
Oh, going back in my Wayback Machine 2010, you're only excluding Toy Story and Inception, which I take exception to Inception because that's still Nolan, and obviously he's not going to want to tread over his same waters. But what are we ignoring the MCU on that one?
Well, here's the thing. It's like going back to what I said previously, I think that there was one coin and there were two sides. There was the Iron Man side,
right?
Which was, Marvel kind of carved out their own formula and they stuck with it. And I give Marvel all the credit in the world in the face of The Dark Knight, when not just superhero movies, but a lot of movies tended to go darker, grittier. They stayed the course with what worked for their franchises. On the other side of the coin was The Dark Knight. And I think when you have something like, I point to the A-Team because that was supposed to be the big movie of the summer.
Right.
That was the June tentpole. That was supposed to be it. And I think that was still stuck in neither one of those territories.
Yeah, it was very Fast and Furious.
Exactly. It didn't hit. And this is not, this episode is not an indictment of the A-Team. It's more of like, I definitely think had Dark Knight not come out in 2008, Tron Legacy might tonally have a very different feel to it, because like you said, when you watch the first Tron and then you watch this one, it's very, the dichotomy of the two. It's a 180 tonal shift, in my opinion.
Very true. Very, very true.
So this was again, I think when you talk about these Tron movies, the first thing that you come up with is visually, it pushes boundaries. So how does something like Tron Legacy push boundaries? And that brings us to the elephant in the room. When you do bring up Tron Legacy these days, usually the conversation starts here, so we'll do it too.
All right.
This was really, Benjamin Button had come out in 2008, and that was a combination of CGI, makeup, and all sorts of different effects. But this was, for my money, the first big swing at de-aging and digitally composing an entire human character to look like a younger version of that actor.
Very true.
And sometimes it kind of worked, and sometimes it did not.
That is true, but that's also that's the crime of the first time. You know what I mean? Like, it's the same statement that can be used if you go back and you look at The Matrix Reloaded, and they did the 100 Smith brawl. There are quite a few times where you can clearly see that this is all a CGI piece, but it was the first time that had ever been attempted. So in retrospect, sure, it's going to look a little hanky, a little, I can see through that magic, but look at where we are now. Like, you look at Thanos in Endgame and he looks as real as everyone else.
I 100% land on that side of it, where even at the time, honestly, there's only one or two shots watching this back again that, like, I'm just like, oh man, like, if you knew it was a little rough, I don't know if I would have hung on that. the only one that really just, I'm like, woof, take it back, is the very beginning of the movie, where he's talking to his son, and then he turns around in full close up, and just it's like Grand Theft Auto cutscene Jeff Bridges. But I'm with you. I think you have to crawl before you can run, and I don't think that you get a Michael Douglas at the beginning of Ant-Man,
right?
Unless someone kind of strikes out and does it. And what I think the brilliance of this movie is, first of all, I think you get away with a lot because Clue is a digital character,
right?
Like, his character is supposed to be digital. But what they did that I thought was really clever, and maybe they could have incorporated this a little bit more, was when he has flashbacks and he's telling Sam kind of about what happened to him and how he got stuck. It's put in this filter that looks like an old kind of like television set, and it's obscured the digitalness, I feel like, enough that it doesn't 100% distract you.
Did you feel like that was a meta statement? Because I always did. That
in terms of,
so based on the development of tech, the flashback stuff was more of an analog visual, and the clarity that you are supposed to have later on is more of the digital sort of showcase. So that's why you had that look to it, because that's about the apex of technology from the time that he did that.
I mean, that's a great observation, and I think it's one of those things that works. It's such a creative solve to how do we get around this technology that works, but we're still trying to figure out. And it's like, let's put a little Vaseline on the lens if we have to. Yeah, because I think again, sometimes it worked really well. I thought a lot of the stuff with Clue was better than at the beginning of the movie, where which, by the way, I love this visual, and I'm not sure, maybe this ties into what you were just saying, but after he leaves his son's bedroom, they do kind of an exposition dump, but they do it in the most creative way with all these television screens,
Yes.
but it's kind of floating in this ethereal nothingness.
Actually, that kind of fits more into what you were saying as the reference to The Dark Knight, which we clearly know that Nolan was definitely influenced by The Dark Knight Returns, and that was a big piece of exposition. So there's a lot of correlations to what you were saying as well. Like it's a nice little circle that this is creating.
It's just like it feels both abstract, but also like it sets the tone really well. By the way, speaking of setting the tone really well, what this movie does, and what I think they've done it a couple times since then, but I love it when movies start and the company logo is customized to the movie I'm watching.
Yes.
And Disney is not big on it. They've done it, like I said, they've done it a couple of movies, but most of the time it's like, whatever you're watching is going to have that Disney castle, and maybe it'll be customized a little bit, but it's going to be that. This is the coolest customized opening I've ever seen.
100%. Yeah. Because it shows you where you are with this, and it only heightens your anticipation for the visual tech fest that you're about to experience anyway.
Now we're getting into a point where, the story, here's the thing what I say about this movie, because, like I said, one of the biggest criticisms of the first Tron movie overall was people said it was convoluted, it didn't make sense. And with this movie, Tron Legacy, I kind of feel like the plot is super complex, but the story is very simple. And I think maybe that's why it hit for me more. I was able to digest it a little easier than the first Tron.
That's an interesting take. I want to hear. Yeah, keep going with that.
So I think, when you talk about, this is a very simple, and this is like quintessential Disney, is the missing parent, and, kind of about, as the title says, the legacy of Kevin Flynn. And I think it's, at its heart, it's about how we communicate with each other. It's about, the father and son relationship. But what I really like the most about it is Clue being the villain is such a great, I mean, it's a little on the head, on the nose, but it's a kid's Disney movie. Give me a break. But I love that it's like, if I were to look at things that I've done in my youth, in my life, and it manifested itself as a personification of me, it's like looking your younger self in the mirror at all your ideals and all your snobbery and all of your pretentiousness, and seeing the error of your ways literally in your face, which I think is like such a great kind of a takeaway for the character of Flynn, and it lets future actual Jeff Bridges, play a different side to the character of Flynn, kind of this more Zen character, almost,
right.
Like borderline like Buddhist,
So, all right. So with this, what you're saying is that it is still commentating on the idea of legacy, and part of that legacy is the maturity of recognizing that your younger ideals are in fact flawed, no matter how genuine you attempted to make them.
I don't know if it's necessarily like that sweeping, but I definitely think it's like when, Flynn is kind of looking at the legacy of himself through the eyes of both his greatest failure, which is Clue, and his greatest success, which is his son. And I think that's very simple, where I say that's a simple story to me. The plot kind of, as soon as you start talking about ISOs and discs, and we have to go to this MacGuffin to get that MacGuffin, that's where, sometimes the movie is just like a little all over the place in terms of plot. But in terms of story, I feel like emotionally it's all grounded in something very basic and understandable.
So here's where we will interestingly disagree.
Okay.
And not because I think that you're wrong. I think what you're saying is absolutely right from that perspective. That was never the perspective of the story that I got. Much in the same way that we've got this series that is called Tron, and it's never about Tron. Tron Legacy, even though Sam seems to be the main character, I don't think the plot is about Sam. It's about Clue wanting out. That's really what the impetus of the entire story really is that Clue wants out. He doesn't want to stay in this space, and he's looking for freedom. And that was always the story that I got out of it. And part of that is because I recognize that as Tron is not actually about Tron, it's more about, Flynn. I always looked at this sequel as something that wasn't quite about the person that that you keep following. That's not the guy.
Sure. I guess to me, this movie, just like the other movie, is still about Kevin Flynn.
Okay.
Like it never wasn't. I think Tron is it's a
better name than Flynn.
This is a better name. Flynn is kind of like a dumb name for a movie, and right. Clue was already taken.
Call it the Kev.
The Kev. Yeah. I hear what you're saying, and I kind of feel like with Clue wanting to get out, that's almost, I don't know. I so clearly see Clue, as an extension of part of Kevin's flaws, that it's kind of like, you're battling literally your own ego,
right?
Because that's what Clue is. It's kind of what Flynn, he goes on the news conference. It's like, I've got something that's going to change the world. Me, I. When he he kind of neglected his son, and who knows what Sam could end up doing,
right? So
I still see it as Flynn's movie, even though he's not postured as such, because right. I think it'd be asinine to see 60-year-old Jeff Bridges on a light cycle.
Whatever, man. I would have loved that. Come on now.
We're going to take a quick break real quick. When we come back, we're going to talk more about light cycles. We're going to talk about Garrett Hedlund, and we're going to talk about Olivia Wilde, and maybe a little caster talk as well. All coming up. Stay tuned. But first, a quick message.
Boys, girls, it is I, Uber producer John Peters, the mastermind behind Reboot It, your favorite YouTube series. The boys in the development room are back for season 2 with all of my best ideas in tow. It's streaming exclusively on YouTube because, of course, you've got to see it to believe it. You can't just listen with your ears, you have to listen with your eyes. Join the serviceable hacks on my development team. Billy Business, and from the Nerd Goat podcast, whatever the hell that is, Ed Greer, Ron Swallow, and producer, in air quotes, Bill. This season, I am tackling reboots of all of your favorite franchises, cream of the crop that need the special Peters magic. Franchises like Lord of the Rings, Masters of the Universe, TV franchises like Knight Rider, and of course, my white whale, Superman. So head on over to the Reboot It YouTube page, subscribe, hit the bell, which they assure me is a thing that has meaning, and do not miss a single second of this hot season 2 with yours truly, John Peters, and Billy Business, Ed Greer, Ron Swallow, and producer Bill, if you care. The real news is that I'm there every single episode. Go subscribe.
And we're back. So we've been talking a lot about, the story of Tron Legacy. We're talking a lot about Jeff Bridges. Let's talk about who the kind of, he's positioned as the main character, at least in all the marketing. And we definitely are kind of seeing everything through his point of view. Talking about Garrett Hedlund playing Sam, Kevin Flynn's son. I think he got a little more grief that, look, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say Garrett Hedlund's great and that he's, a shining actor. But I think he was unfairly maligned. Like, saying he was just terrible and boring and dry, I feel like is maybe a step too far.
Yeah. I can't give him that. I think that falls more on the director and what it seemed like he was seeking. Especially like in comparison to who else is in this movie. Like, it's not fair for Garrett to really be compared to Bridges. You know what I mean? Like, Bridges is a living legend and can basically do no wrong. So to compare the two as to who's supposed to be the most charismatic on screen is almost like it's wrong. You shouldn't do that to him.
Well, also too, it's like you put him next to Jeff Bridges, who's super charismatic, you put him next to young Jeff Bridges, which is just your eyes always drawn to the technical marvel of the CG.
Right.
You put him next to Olivia Wilde, and not even just that she's a beautiful woman, but she just has these eyes, these blue piercing eyes that just kind of, again, draw your attention. It's like, it's just unfortunate that he's surrounded by much more interesting things to look at the entire
Let alone
movie.
Michael Sheen. Come on, can we talk about how he stole the show?
Oh, I mean, that was the best David Bowie Ziggy Stardust impression I have ever seen in a movie. Better than anything that I could have thought of. And again, that's where I say, like, the plot gets a little like, could you have like streamlined that, and did you need that character? You absolutely did not need Castor. But that's kind of some of the fun stuff of this movie, is just like, all right, if in this new Grid 2.0, well, what are some of these characters? What are some of these programs that are running wild? What do they look like? And I have to say, in terms of rogue programs, I'll take a Castor over a Merovingian any day of the week.
I mean, his parties seem to be better, that's for sure.
I mean, I just like the vibe of the Grid a little bit better than the Matrix, but, who am I to say?
I mean, no, that's fair. The Matrix was very green, and there was like a cool minty blue with Castor's play, so I'm with that. I'm 100%. And, better DJs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have to talk about the soundtrack, because I feel like there's two things that come up when you talk about Tron Legacy. One is the de-aging CGI, and two is the Daft Punk soundtrack. And I feel like this soundtrack goes in the bucket with the 1998 Godzilla movie, with Batman Forever, in terms of soundtracks that kind of had their own popularity completely away from the movie itself.
I'm 100% in agreement with you on that one. Absolutely.
Yeah, it was almost like it was weird, because when the soundtrack was such a hot seller, it was not indicative of people's actual interest in the film.
Well, because the soundtrack actually carries a story a bit better than the film does. Like there seems to be a better plot transition, pace, all set up for the soundtrack that doesn't quite translate to the movie.
Yeah, it's, with film being such a visual medium, and I've seen a couple movies do this where they release the Blu-ray and there's like an audio only or a score only track. I would have loved to have seen just a score only cut of this movie, because I feel like you can understand genuinely, or generally, I should say, what's happening just from the music.
Absolutely. I think you can say genuinely too, because I think you're absolutely right. They did that great of a job scoring this film that the tone and sense of things carries through with very little dialogue necessary.
Yeah, and I do think, like, again, like, it's been a while since I've actually watched the first Tron. I don't know if it had the kind of the theme that they give this movie. There's a theme that plays at the beginning, during the opening narration, and then again at the end of the movie, that it's really super catchy. It's a great theme, but I don't know if that carries over from the first movie. If not, hats off to them for coming up with like a great score for this movie.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about Olivia Wilde and kind of her character, because I thought this was like an interesting concept that, as much as I do like this movie and I do enjoy it, I kind of felt like this was interesting but tacked on. Was kind of like her race of people, or whatever they are, the ISOs. They're kind of like they had this immaculate conception. They were programmed, I guess, out of nowhere, and they never really quite they never make you understand. They're like, this could have changed science. It could have changed medicine. It's like, how? Like,
how does this work?
What's the significance? Like, they tell you she's important, and they tell you that she's the last of this very significant thing, but they never, like, she exhibits no special abilities that it's like, oh, okay, like, we keep talking about the Matrix. It's like, at least with Neo, we understood he's the only one that can do this one thing.
Right.
Like, she doesn't really, like, they give her badass moments, but she could have just been anyone.
So before we get deeply into her, I kind of want to point this out that the way this story is set up in its telling is very similar to what's called the Paul Levitt's paradigm for storytelling in comics, where you have typically 3 sets of story beats. You have an A story, B story, and a C story. And the way that they permeate or dominate the storytelling scape is you focus on the A story, you kind of bring in parts of the B story, and then you introduce C until you rotate them all out. And I think that the introduction of the ISOs, not that it was totally out of the blue, it was that the previous A-B stories were wrapping up, and this is part of the C story that is supposed to translate even further if there was a sequel. I just want to throw that out there.
But I think, that's maybe the best example I can give of different mediums have different ways of telling stories that work for them. And I don't know if this necessarily worked for me.
I don't know that it did. You're absolutely right, because obviously we didn't get the sequel, therefore that hurts any sort of storytelling that this could have actually set up or anything like that. But you are 100% right by way of looking at Korra and seeing that while she is supposed to be this being of imminent promise, we never quite understand what that's supposed to be. And at the same time, what's really almost paradoxical is Q's or Clue's, not Q, Clue's like total point of view that they're an aberration, that they're a problem and should be eliminated, that they're a flaw. How is it possible that you can have 2 so extremely different views come from the same person looking at the same thing? That becomes a very interesting sort of question for what her character actually is this weird enigma where, like you said, if Clue is this extension of Kevin Flynn and he sees it as this total flaw, but then Kevin Flynn himself is like, look at the possibilities of this. How are those 2 things so diametrically opposed in this one character? That's such a weird thing.
It's like this fallback, and I've yet to truly, even sci-fi movies that, like dystopian sci-fi movies that I love, I'm talking Terminator 2, I'm talking, all these other, kind of killer robot things, but it seems to be the motivation, like I'm thinking of like Age of Ultron, is always humans are flawed, and the only way for a better world is to get rid of humans. And it's like we never really get past that mode of thinking. You're right. It's like them existing because they're an algorithm that didn't exist before, and him just saying, well, it's not perfect. It's like, I feel like that's not enough anymore for a story,
Right. Especially when there's no real understanding as to why they're not perfect.
I think it's more interesting to, if we had gotten a little bit more, and maybe this is all implied and I just, didn't pick it up or the movie didn't drop it down, but that Clue is threatened by their existence in terms of, his ego being bruised. Is he not really the best suited to rule over the grid if he is no longer the top dog, if these perfect isometric beings can replace him? But again, it's like you have to pick a lane. It's like, and I think that's where maybe things get a little off the rails a little bit, is like, okay, you're right. Is Clue an extension of Flynn, in which case it has to be emotionally driven, which is his ego does not want to let these things survive? Or is it robotic and we have like the Matrix or Terminator Skynet type of thing where it's like, in order for a perfect world to exist, it must be a perfect world as defined at the time by Flynn. And since these have no definition in that world, they must be eliminated. But then it's like they didn't pick either of those lanes. So it makes no sense why he would then go after Flynn and Tron at all,
Well, as I'm sure we're getting ready to get into, there's a lot of parts of this story that really make no sense whatsoever. Visually amazing, storytelling wise, quite bankrupt in terms of logic or any factual sense whatsoever.
But at a certain point, and I hate to say this because this is the equivalent of the just turn your brain off argument, which which I'll admit I'm a hypocrite. I use it as both a shield and a weapon, depending on what movie we're talking about. But it's
That's
like,
fair.
At what point going into Tron Legacy, knowing what Tron kind of is and was, like, I don't know. I just feel like this movie does have its own inconsistencies, and if you watch it, on an island, yeah, maybe it sticks out more. But boy, if you watch that first one first, this one just seems so much more coherent and clear, and there's a through line that, like, it's hard for me to really, like, knock it with a fine tooth comb unless I'm really, looking for things.
I mean, and that's fair. That's almost like saying, in comparison to a Nintendo system, the PlayStation 1 is freaking magic. But if you were to look at, what a PS4 can do versus a PS1, you'll laugh. Right. It's that same sort of idea. But the thing is as we have matured as storytellers, especially in film, from the point of Tron versus Tron Legacy, there are some things that, frankly, for me, I don't give you the allowance of. Just because you were better than what came before doesn't make you the best version of what you can be right now. And that's kind of where I fall into play when it comes to a lot of parts of the story of Tron Legacy.
I just don't know if there's anything like super detrimental, though. Like, I get that Clue's kind of MO is maybe a little muddy at best, but it doesn't necessarily change the beats of the story, or it doesn't change like the emotional through line, because this movie is, even if it doesn't want to admit it to itself, is incredibly melodramatic. Like, you kind of know, like, he's a mustache twirling bad guy and he wants to escape. Like, I'm not going to say it's irrelevant, but it's certainly not as relevant as what his actions are in the movie.
That's true. I think for me, the point where it does break down, is a very pivotal space where we as Sam are being introduced to this new iteration of the grid. When that happens is one of the points where the storytelling and the logic behind it is the weakest of the entire movie. Because if you think about it, like, Sam goes there because Alan gets a page, presumably from Clue, right? Clue is trying to get someone to open up the portal. When that happens, there's a whole sequence of events that occur before Clue is ever, or the knowledge that Sam is there is ever brought to Clue. Even though it seemingly is supposed to be Clue's plan the entire time, he doesn't know that it's actually worked until Sam gets cut by Tron in the arena. Like, there's a whole bunch of sequencing that actually happens that doesn't make any sense if this was your actual plan. You would think that, one, you would know there are places that you need to search for as entry points. I mean, I'd like to think that as the arcade, Flynn's Arcade is built within the grid. That's one of the key places that if anybody comes in and out of that spot, Clue's gonna know. But he doesn't. Once Sam gets arrested, he actually has to fight within the games. They don't even know that he's a person, that he's not a program until he gets cut. Like, that's so many different things that they are trying to just show us something cool that they absolutely sacrifice logic and story in order to get us there.
Look, if I want to do some mental gymnastics, I can
do it.
I could tell myself that, look, they make it very clear, or they maybe not very clear, but they do kind of say in the movie that time is very different in the grid than it is outside. What could be hours in the grid is mere minutes in the real world.
Right.
So who knows how long ago Clue sent that page to Alan.
That page. I mean, obviously he sent it a long time ago because we don't even use pagers no more.
He could have just assumed it just didn't work or no one was coming.
You're trying so hard.
It's so hard to find good help these days.
You are, man. You're trying so hard. Even though there's a big light beacon that opens up at the top of the city. No. He didn't know that opened up. I got you. I'm with you.
Look, you're right. Should he have had someone stationed there like forever and just be like, if anything comes through? But then again, like, we don't know. I was gonna say we don't know like if anyone else is trying to get in or out. But at that point, if anyone else is able to do it, why wouldn't Clue?
Right.
You're right. Look, at that point, you're 20-ish minutes into the movie, and they're like, if we don't put a light cycle or something on the screen at this point, people are going to start to get antsy. And that's why we were talking before this went on the air. I said, where did you watch this? And you said Disney Plus. And it's kind of a bummer that Disney Plus doesn't do the shifting aspect ratios. A lot of the stuff in the grid for this movie was filmed in full IMAX, which if you've ever been to, not a Limax, not a quasi-IMAX, but if you've ever been to a real true IMAX theater and it's, the screen is the size of a legit like 5-story building, when it goes from widescreen to full is right when he gets in the grid for those first round of games. I think you are so enthralled by the visuals because the Blu-ray tries to replicate it. It goes from, widescreen and then it opens up as full as your TV will go. Not quite the same thing, but
right.
I think you're so enthralled by the visuals that those questions of why and how are, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's just kind of like because it had to. Because because you'd be so pissed if you got this far into the movie and there was no Tron Gladiator games.
Let's be frank here, man. If it wasn't for the Tron cycle racing in the trailers, we wouldn't have known what that movie was.
That's 100% true. Because like we said earlier, aesthetically, this movie is so different from its predecessor that you would never really know. Like this could have been. That's why I call this almost like a soft reboot, because other than the ties to like Clue and Flynn, like you can easily walk into this movie never having even heard of the first one and 100% get it.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
But you have to admit, like, we talked a little bit about the de-aging and how it, some of it, a lot of it, doesn't quite hold up. But I'll put those light cycle race scenes up against any movie coming out now, and they still like are enthralling and they look fantastic.
100%. I'll even go as far as to say the costume design work within the grid, especially, is one of those things that our work in the Comic-Con market. I thought that the Tron Legacy cosplay would live a lot longer than it did, because just visually speaking, those were phenomenal. The only thing I can imagine is that maybe the longevity of like the LED light structure or something wasn't as practical as people thought, as the only reason why I don't see that too often. But I can almost pinpoint as a year, like 2016 forward, I've not seen a Tron Legacy cosplay since. And I think that's something interesting, considering how, amazing the costuming was.
The costuming was great, and there's some funny things some funny articles if you want to go back and look yourself about, like, you're 100% right. How big of a pain in the ass those suits were. They required 134 LED lights.
Wow.
And they were attached via magnet, and it was like sewn in a way that like they couldn't really sit down very well. They kind of had to just lean over on things when they weren't filming. That's
amazing.
That's probably why you don't see a lot of people like successfully recreating the Tron look, but it is an interesting look. So this movie came out in December. This was like Disney's big kind of Christmas offering. And, I think we have it in our heads that this movie didn't do well. And that's not 100% true.
Really?
Like it did. It was fairly successful at the box office. I think it's one of those things now where it's like, if a Batman movie came out and made $450 million, people would be like, failure, throw it away, poop on it. And it's like, well,
actually,
it's a sliding scale. So this grossed like I think a little over 400 million during its entire theatrical run, which was considered a success, but maybe not quite what they were banking on. You know, I don't know if maybe they thought this was going to be a way bigger thing than it was. And then you know, a sequel was kind of in the works, and you know, after a while, I think you know, Garrett Hedlund said he was coming back, and Kaczynski said he was coming back, but Olivia Wilde dropped out. And then, so this is kind of interesting. This is from an article in January of 2018, where Garrett Hedlund was doing an interview, and he said that he thinks that the box office performance of not Tron Legacy, but of Brad Bird's Tomorrowland was the reason that Tron 3 was kind of put on the shelf indefinitely. Any thoughts about that?
Ooh, so another well, okay. I can kind of see a through line being that they are wholly fictional realities type stories. And I can't say that I can think of one that Disney had that was successful beyond Pirates of the Caribbean. So if at the time where things was a little funky and it wasn't Pirates, then I can see them backing off of it. I wouldn't say that was the thing, though. I would say that what honestly Tron was supposed to be for Disney especially was the entryway into stuff for boys. And it was supposed to be another, you know, stepping stone. They tried Power Rangers. That didn't work. They were going to do Tron. And that was supposed to be this thing where they could do video games and action figures. And it didn't quite pop like they wanted to. And rather than come back to that, they bought Marvel. And then they ended up buying Star Wars. So all the things that Tron could have been for them to try to build, they bought stuff that already had it built in, so they didn't have to. So I wouldn't just say that it was Tomorrowland. I would say that it was the total idea of what Tron was supposed to be that it didn't quite do for them.
I hear you. And just to be 100% clear, I know you're not insinuating this, but just so it's blanket said.
I might be. I don't know. Let's see it.
That was Garrett Hedlund's quote. I don't think there's anyone,
yeah.
You know, no one from the studio that's like, well, but I do think, you know, Disney has this great skill, especially if you have Disney Plus and you've watched the Imagineering story, which is fascinating and I 100% recommend. But they have this amazing skill of, I'm not going to say that they rewrite their own history. What I am going to say is they will feature the history they want you to remember most clearly. And they do a very good job of kind of, you know, sweeping the bad things under the rug. And I think Tomorrowland was one of their first massive, like, what happened?
Right.
You know, this was supposed to be, you had a big star, George Clooney. You have a beloved director, Brad Bird. You have a Disney IP with Tomorrowland, something new, something innovative. And it failed. And this was in a period of time where, you know, when we think of Disney in the late 2000s, you think a lot of, like you said, Pirates of the Caribbean, you know, the Marvel movies. You think of Star Wars. What you don't think of and what they don't want you to think of is Tomorrowland, Mars Needs Moms, The Lone Ranger. And I 100% think that you are on the money. I think they got to a point where they realized us trying to take these properties, these IPs that maybe aren't worth as much and make them worth a lot is not as successful as taking and buying something that's already worth a lot and making it worth even more. And I feel like Tron Legacy, unfortunately, is in that bucket of something that they had in-house that they thought maybe they could turn into something that was their own kind of blockbuster franchise. And for one reason or another, it didn't happen. And I do wonder if Tron Legacy had been a smash. We're talking like $800-900 million gross, you know, basically double what it got.
Right.
would that have changed the landscape of Disney's strategy in terms of acquiring these other properties? Because like I said, you throw in, look at the laundry list of movies that didn't work. Your Tomorrowlands, your John Carter of Mars. Like,
right.
They were taking some really big swings and doing some really big misses. And I just wonder if one of those or a couple of those had connected, if we wouldn't even have an MCU like we do today.
I think we would still have the MCU, but it would not be under Disney's control. I don't think that would have been the move that they made. I would even say, I would go as far as to say, if Tron Legacy, based on the design of what kind of movie it was, came out in the summer, it would have made more money. I think it would have done better at that point, because there's so many economic factors that you have to think about with movies like that if they're not of a certain type of franchise, they're going to suffer. If it doesn't play into something that exists in a way that is marketable, like Harry Potter. Harry Potter has worked very well during the Christmas season, because you release a Harry Potter movie, the adoration of the books skyrockets, and you can add those books as Christmas gifts, in your pile. That's easy. Tron is a little harder. Like you have to know, what aspect of it that somebody liked. If there was a video game, do they have the system? There was too many things that make it not quite congruent with the Christmas season release. But if it came out in the summer and you had time to see different things come out of that, man, that could have been insane.
Yeah, especially in a summer that was, again, not really that exciting outside of, Inception was kind of the one that's most remembered, Toy Story 3. But like I said, there were a lot of movies that came out in the summer of 2010 that they were really banking on, A-Team, The Losers, a lot of these like team movies, which was kind of weird, that didn't succeed. What's interesting too about Tron Legacy is, when you talk about, some of those failures that Disney had, I'm talking the Lone Rangers, the John Carters of Mars, they came and then they very quietly died a horrible death. Tron, on the other hand, it came and there was a lot of fanfare that's still there in terms of Disney's presence. Like, they had the Electronica dance party at California Adventures. That lasted until April of 2012. There is a Tron, there's a whole Tron ride, a whole Tron roller coaster that is new at Shanghai Disneyland. So it's like, it's very strange that, Tron is not a huge success, but it's also not a failure. It's kind of on this line where I would have thought they would have given it one more, maybe slash the budget a little bit to see if they could milk the Tron teat one more time, or at least push it one way or the other in terms of, do people want this or not? I know they had the animated series, but I don't really count that in terms of, although I'll say, you don't make an animated series for a movie that, well, no, that's 100% not true.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
I was just about to say, I'm pretty sure bringing back Godzilla, that they made like an animated series about the 1998 Godzilla.
Yes, they did. But I mean, to your point though, they at least have recognized that there are absolute elements of Tron Legacy that were in fact popular. Even if it wasn't necessarily the movie, there are things that they can glean from it that people did enjoy.
Yeah, and I just wonder, like, is it too late? If they announce Tron 3, next year, I don't know. I kind of feel like they didn't strike while the iron was at least lukewarm. And I think now with the way that video games are and the way that, I was playing around with one of those virtual reality headsets before the Christmas break this year. And I played like the Darth Vader Star Wars virtual reality game. And it is so eerily real that seeing something kind of hyper stylized like the grid almost feels quaint. It's like watching Back to the Future now when they go to 2015. You're like, that's cute, That's cute that's what you thought that would be.
That's
like,
that's what you thought you were gonna get. Aw.
I don't know where you go with a Tron 3 at this point, and that's why I'm like, I just don't know if it ever will or even should happen.
So I think it definitely will happen. I think what we will get is not a theatrical release. I think we will get something via Disney Plus as a long form, choose your own adventure, don't sue me, sort of piece. I think to a big degree, once things settle with Netflix and Choose Your Own Adventure Co., we will see something similar in the form of Tron Legacy on Disney Plus.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree. But that's the thing. I also don't know if I disagree. I truly don't know how Disney feels about the Tron franchise, because I feel like they at least think it's profitable enough to, put in their parks, which is definitely saying something. You don't see a Lone Ranger, roller coaster.
I would be remiss to see such a thing. Please no.
The Hi-Ho Silver at Paris Disneyland. But yeah, the fact that they've slept on it, there's really no merchandise. They had, like I said, they had the show, even the video game that they came out with. Now it's, there hasn't been a newer video game for any updated platform. I don't know, but I don't know if I blame. It's easy to blame Tron Legacy as like, well, this one failed and that's why we'll never see another one again. I'm like, I don't think it's that cut and dry.
True. Very true. There's too many parts that are surviving for that. Like you said, there's not the Lone Ranger. You don't see a John Carter, exhibit, which would be dope, by the way. Can you imagine going to Mars and then all of a sudden you're bouncing around this place? That would be fantastic.
Oh, I love it.
That doesn't exist. And those were clear sentiments that people were not interested in any part of that. Like, I couldn't tell you who did the soundtrack to those, but there are things that I am 100% fully aware and absolutely still engaged when it comes to Tron Legacy that I think it has legs elsewhere.
As you're talking about Tron and Disney Plus, I may walk back what I said a little bit, because I'm circling back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this, where, there's only 2 Tron movies, but each time that they came out, they broke some sort of ground or really, pushed the envelope in some form or fashion. And I'm wondering if almost you wait on Tron 3 until, technology has evolved even more, where there's some new, like, I would love it if Tron kind of became this barometer of where technology was going to go 10 years from now, because that's essentially what those first 2 movies do. They telegraph where things are going to go in the next 10 years.
That's true. And I mean, also think about the notion that one of the quote unquote criticisms is the de-aging, which now has a far greater showcase now than it did 10 years ago. That's so crazy that it was only 10 years ago that was even, created and used like that. But in that regard, how many different things can you now explore 10 years later? It's going to be crazy. And I think the notion of VR is also a thing that they would be remiss to leave out. Imagine something where you've got a headset that now interacts with your Disney Plus and you are in the grid. Please and thank you. Like, now all of a sudden Disney is competing with PlayStation and Xbox by accident. Like, that'd be amazing.
Well, there's all these kind of rumors online with everything that's going on right now with the coronavirus that Disney stocks are so low, and this is a great time for Apple to swoop in and finally buy Disney. I mean, like, as absurd as that maybe would have sounded 2 months ago, who knows? True. Exactly what you just said could 100% come to fruition.
Then I need a check. Okay, I'm just saying. If that does happen,
it's just
throw me something.
It's such a funny time stamp too, of like, because when you watch that first Tron, you're like, oh, this is so dated. And then I was watching this one, and the thing that immediately stuck out to me is like, we don't do that anymore. Was everyone freaking out about like, oh no, the newest Windows thing, the operating system's going to go online for free. I'm like, yeah, that's how that works now.
Yeah,
like that's what we do.
It just automatically updates. Like I woke up to a new OS. I don't even know.
Yeah, it's like, what do we got? Amazing. Catalina, El Capitan. I don't even know what they call them anymore.
Actually, I'm gonna go back instead.
So like that's what I'm saying though. It's like these Tron movies end up being kind of almost like fun time capsules, but again, they kind of telegraph where things are going in a technological kind of way. So yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing Tron 3 come a little bit down the road when it's like, what else are we gonna get?
Right.
But that being said too, you know, like I still think, as bare basic of a story as it is about a father and a son and kind of wrestling with your own legacy, it clicks for me. Does it 100% work all the time? No, but I think, you know, on a more macro scale, if I kind of step back and look at, you know, the whole thing of what it's saying, like it mostly works.
Yeah, it definitely holds the visual cue. I think if anything, what I'm gonna step out there and say it. If anything, what Tron Legacy exposed was the lack of thinking in a total media space of what could be. Because we're talking potential books, we're talking comics, we're talking video games. I think it still holds up tremendously on its own, but that's the real flaw of what Tron Legacy is that it exposed what Disney did not know that they could then do with a single property that they kind of know now with the Infinity games and all that stuff. They know they can do a lot more integration of a property in multiple platforms, and Tron kind of signified that.
Do you think that Tron Legacy would have been a completely different ball game had it come out maybe 2 or even 3 years later than it did?
No. I think the way that it would have been a game changer is if it came out earlier. Yeah. Later, you're putting it up against too many other groundbreaking properties, and I think earlier things were still of the same old hat, at least visually, that, you know, it wouldn't have been as crazy to see that stuff visually.
Yeah, I mean, it was tough too because like the year before, the holiday season before, we had just gotten Avatar, and that changed the game, you know, like it or not, for 3D and kind of spectacle. So yeah, maybe Tron just kind of missed the boat. It just is. It came out at a weird time for cinema. Like I said, this was right when cinema was just kind of changing over into kind of predominantly superhero-driven stuff.
That's facts. Absolute facts, man.
So that's Tron Legacy. Hopefully this was a little more coherent than the movies that preceded them. Thank you so much, Victor, for hopping on. You always give such amazing insight. And I want to ask you real quick before we close out.
Yeah.
Since we are in the middle of this kind of pandemic, this coronavirus, and our way of life has changed a lot. And you are my go-to guy as not only a storyteller, but, you know, a guy that I really see as one of the up-and-comers and leaders in the comics industry. Comics are such a big part of my background, and such a big part of a lot of the things that we love. And especially in this downtime where people now can check things out. But the catch-22 being is that, you know, staying at home and not going to the stores. How can people support the comic book industry with what we're going through right now?
So one of the tricky conversations that we're having now, and I operate as a independent comic creator. So I'm not with Marvel, DC. I don't have a distribution deal with Diamond, which is favorable in this moment because Diamond Comics, the major distributor of all mainstream books, announced this week that they are not delivering any more books starting next week. So there's a level of safety that people have in supporting the independent market. They can contact creators directly. If independent creators are smart, what they're doing is they are actively aligning their work with mainstream properties that people know, to say, hey, if you like Batman, then check out my book such and such because it's similar in this way, and that way. Because right now you're not going to be able to get Batman, so why not try this thing that is a similar style to it. The true problem here though is comic shops. With the quarantine status, the lockdown status, you're not really supposed to travel in many places for non-essential items. And as much as I think comics are essential, you might be hard-pressed to make that argument if you get pulled over. So right now, comic shops, which are kind of the budget holders, the price tag wielders of the industry, they're at risk. And that's the hard thing of trying to figure out a way to solve that. It would require a huge amount of altruistic idealism from independent comic creators who would be willing to share their profits with comic shops to keep them afloat. The problem is that a majority of comic shops don't carry a majority of independent work. They predominantly get mainstream stuff. So it's one of those things of, would we be keeping afloat a system that is not directly geared towards supporting us if everything was working out well? And that becomes a very difficult conversation. So right now, definitely support, independent comic creators. If you can, definitely try out some mail order opportunities. I know some comic shops are offering things where they will, mail things out to people. That's a great way of keeping them afloat. If you're still hankering for some indie, or not indie, but mainstream stuff, you can focus specifically on trade paperbacks, which will keep them in business. So that's definitely what I would suggest. More so than going to Amazon, contact your local comic shop and see what you can order and have them send to you.
And where can people find your stuff?
So I'm at Vantage In-House on Twitter, and that is the name of my publishing imprint. So if you go to vantageinhouse.com, you can definitely check things out. But the biggest thing that I'm pushing right now is my in-school program. So I do teaching, showing kids how to make comics, but also riddled with all kinds of educational material. And that's ucreatecomics.com. That's the letter U, CRE8 comics.com. And we've got different art kits, different sets. We've actually got some activity sheets that we're trying to align with different school districts that are giving out free lunches. And we're trying to have these activity sheets added in, kind of like a Happy Meal, just to give kids a little something engaging and to get them off screens for a little while, put some pens to paper and keep them being creative and engaged.
And maybe one of those kids can make me a Tron comic since no one else is going to do it.
I mean, you never know.
Thank you so much for joining me. Still coming up this season, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be doing a supersized episode where we talk every movie of the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy. Also got Punisher Warzone coming up later on this season. Thank you so much for sticking with me, especially in these unsure times. It's always nice to get back to doing this, and hopefully you guys are staying safe, you're staying socially distant, and hopefully you will come back when we will have a new episode right here next week.